From the days of the Roman and Mongol empires to the days of the British Empire and here to the present day of the US Empire, the nature of imperialism has evolved over time. The direct occupation of lands, territories, and peoples by foreign armies were succeeded by the client state and supremacy of finance capital. In the latest lecture/episode of US Imperialism 101, we will be having a brief history lesson on empires and going over how imperialism and empires have taken new form in the modern age. Hi, my name is Joey, and this is the Geopolitical Insurgent. Imperialism is the process of whereby the dominant political economic interests of one country extend their dominance through force over another country or foreign peoples. Throughout history and even presently, the purpose of imperialism and empires were to dominate entire regions, subjugate peoples, and at the very least gain privileged access to the resources of a region. As discussed in the previous lectures, with the links to the last two in the description below, we've seen how imperialism can manifest in a number of ways. We've discussed how this involves the expropriation of the land, labor, resources, and markets of foreign countries through violent and coercive methods. Sovereign governments with alternative economic orders and modes of development that rival the Western political economic order are replaced with client states that serve it. But did the client state always exist? Now, just on a side note, this flowchart has, I would definitely recommend watching the last two videos to get a better understanding of what this flowchart actually means. But if you've watched the other two videos, you'll probably have a better understanding, but I digress. Going back to the days of the old empires, such as the Romans and Mongols, imperialism took the form of plunder and glory, of direct occupation by large armies and territorial conquest. As capitalism developed over the course of the 19th century, late 19th century, imperialism took a form of finance capital, owning the lands, resources, and production of foreign lands. During this time, colonies were established by the major powers to facilitate capital expansion and exploitation. To analyze how we got there, let us make a segue to the book, which I highly recommend reading, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin. In this book written in 1916, Lenin observes how the development of individual capitalist economies culminated in World War I. In the chapters, Lenin analyzes imperialism as not a simple concept, but rather an economic phenomenon, which encompasses 5 essential features stemming from capitalism's development. While I will sum up these features, let us look at a quote from Lenin in this very book that encompassed the 5 features. Imperialism is capitalism in that stage of development in which the dominance of monopolies and finance capital has established itself, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun, in which the division of all territories of the globe among the great capitalist powers has been completed. Going into detail, the first of these features in capitalism development is the formation of monopolies. As markets and competition have winners and losers, increasing concentration of production and subsequent monopoly formation inevitably occur. Lenin especially notes how recessions, due to the boom-bust nature stemming from internal market contradictions, sped up the formation of monopolies over the later 19th century. As monopolies become further entrenched and capital further concentrated, banks play a bigger role, which brings us to the second feature. Lenin notes how banks, once serving simply as an intermediary in the making of payments, have transformed into monopolists with ownership of industrial enterprises. A main reason for this is that banks offered lines of credit to struggling enterprises, including to large enterprises during the recessions inherent in the boom-bust cycles. As bank capital merged with industrial capital, it became a finance capital firmly entrenched in every sector of the economy. Finance capital is accumulated beyond the production process, circulating through the banking and investment structures, and as such always in constant motion. Whether through share ownership of enterprises, positions on boards, access to capital and holdings, or state loans, among other things, this financial oligarchy controlling finance capital came to dominate the industrial and commercial operations of economies. The third feature has to do with the export of capital. Lenin describes how the export of goods was the most typical feature when free competition prevailed, but as monopolies prevailed and wealth concentrated, the export of capital became the typical feature. Domestic markets becoming overripe created the need to seek new markets abroad in countries where profits are usually high due to scarce capital, low wages, cheap land, and cheap raw materials. Through the export of finance capital to foreign nations, not only is a dependency fostered on the credit from banks in imperial nations, but this also allows the banks to dominate the industries, markets, and natural resources of said country. This leads us to the fourth feature, which is as finance capital is exported, this leads to the formation of international monopolies and cartels to coordinate the penetration of overseas markets and formation of spheres of influences. So basically, the largest banks carve up the world among themselves. As Lenin states, as the export of capital increased and as the foreign and colonial relations and the spheres of influences of the big monopolist combines expanded, things naturally gravitated towards an international agreement among these combines and towards the formation of international cartels. Now, this brings us to the last feature, which is the territorial division of the whole world among the major capitalist powers. The colonial policies of countries such as Britain, France, and Germany completed the seizure of the unoccupied territories on the planet. As there was no more markets left to claim, no more land without a deed, the only way to expand and find new markets is through redivision and war. The struggle for overseas markets and spheres of influences inevitably culminated in World War I. While much more was discussed in this book, these are the main points to consider. The development of capitalism and markets transformed free competition into monopolies. With concentration of production and monopolies came the coalescence of baking with industry, giving rise to finance capital. As domestic markets became overripe and less profitable due to market contradictions and monopoly formation, the export of capital exceeded the export of goods, with finance capital seeking new markets abroad to penetrate. As many monopolist firms from the major capitalist powers all had the same idea, this culminated in an endless struggle among the international monopolies and major capitalist powers to divide the world among themselves. Once again, I highly recommend reading this book and getting a more innate understanding of imperialism in the context of capitalism's development. While the book was written in the context of the conditions amidst World War I, much of its tenets and analysis is relevant to understanding imperialism and empire as a whole today. Capitalism's development gave rise to a new type of imperialism, and its posture has changed from the supremacy of armies to the supremacy of finance capital. To quote someone from the previous videos, Michael Parente in the book Against Empire, which is another book I highly recommend reading, and one which I will do a review on in the future, let us look at capitalist imperialism differs from these earlier forms in the way it systematically accumulates capital through the organized exploitation of land and the penetration of overseas markets. Capitalist imperialism invests in other countries, dominating their economies, cultures, and political life, and integrating their productive structures into an international system of capital accumulation. This system of capital accumulation was protected then by colonies backed by direct occupation, such as the British Empire, for example, and it's protected now with client states backed by military and financial support, let's say the US Empire, for example. Under modern-day imperialism, finance capital has become an occupying force. Countries that choose to undertake alternative political economic orders and independent development undermine this system, and as such are targets of coercive and aggressive actions by imperialist countries like the United States, who fight to uphold this very system. Let me be clear. Imperialism is older than capitalism, so it simply can't be reduced to, say, the export of capital, for example. But rather, it is important to understand the evolution and current manifestations of imperialism in the context of capitalism's development and core features. Throughout this lecture, we discussed how imperialism and empires in general evolved from the supremacy of armies to the supremacy of capital, from direct occupation to client state, and from seizing territory to seizing markets. In the next episode/lecture of US Imperialism 101, we will be going into case studies regarding the superpower client-state relationship and more specifics on how imperialism has affected the countries it's affected. Now, before we leave, let us go to a final quote by Vladimir Lenin. Imperialism is the epoch of finance capital and of monopolies, which introduced everywhere the striving for domination, not for freedom. This was another report by the Geopolitical Insurgent. Feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.